I'm Demi. This is my dog, Doug. And I'm going to be telling you guys about Kabuki syndrome.
Can you introduce me? Okay, and I'm Demi's mom, and I've come along to help explain some things about Kabuki syndrome. Can everybody hear me, or should I have the mic too?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So I think everyone here probably knows that Demi's a little different, and we're here to explain that she has Kabuki syndrome, and that's just really a scientific difference within her genes. We're going to talk a little bit about that and some current events that are going on with science that are directly related to her. So what is Kabuki syndrome? For anybody who doesn't know, a syndrome is just a whole collection of symptoms that are all related to the same thing. So if you hear anybody that has such and such syndrome, that just means they share a set of symptoms. And that's true for Demi too. You can see this is a website specifically for Kabuki syndrome. And you see who's up here? That's Demi.
No, it's 7.
That's when she was 7, yes. That's a little bit old picture, but that's Demi nonetheless. And so some things, for example, that a lot of kids with Kabuki syndrome have are heart defects. Demi, for example, was born with 5 heart defects, one of which, if they hadn't fixed it, she would have died. So they fixed that, and she continues on. Another thing that a lot of them have trouble with is coordination, for example. And even as a little tiny baby doesn't know anything, right? But yet, have you ever thought about how much coordination it takes to eat? You gotta move your jaw, you gotta move your tongue, you gotta swallow. And she had trouble doing that even as a little tiny baby. So much so that the doctors had to stick a tube into her belly. And that's where we put the milk for a little while, and then she worked at it every day, 3 times a day. We worked at eating, and then eventually they could snip off the tube and she could eat. But it just took a little longer for her to learn it, but eventually she did. And so kids with Kabuki syndrome can have a variety of different issues. But I just want you to know that it's a genetic syndrome, and that's why she was giving you the heads up on genetics. So we're going to talk about some genetics and what is going on with it. So on the next slide, we're going to learn about what the latest is with Kabuki syndrome. And what's exciting about it is this Dr. Bjornson, he's a genetics researcher, and he's conducting an experiment right now that is specifically on Kabuki syndrome. And he is going to try to discover some certain things. The title of his experiment is Exploring Kabuki Syndrome as a Treatable Cause of Intellectual Disability, which is a really long title, but basically telling if he can cure Kabuki syndrome, or at least some of the effects of it. And this particular study involves blood, doctors, and rats. So first we're going to talk about a little background. Like Ms. Messer already said, you've already learned this about how the DNA combines into genes, and these little black lines are supposed to be the genes, and then you have your chromosomes. And that's kind of similar to the way a computer is constructed, and I'm sure you're all familiar with that. So you have a microchip, and that makes the circuit boards, and then that goes into a computer. This happens to be the inside of an iPad. Now, if you have an iPad, just the internals of it, does it do you any good?
No.
What does it need to work?
A touchscreen display, a power source.
That's true. What makes the touchscreen display? How does it know to do that?
You have to program it.
You have to program it, right? And what's that called?
Coding.
It's software. Okay, same thing. Coding, software. You have to have software on a computer. It doesn't do any good, right? It's just a hunk of metal sitting there if you don't have software. And you know what? Your genes, your DNA, that's like a whole hunk of nothing if it doesn't know what to do. Think about all of your cells have the same genetic code, right? It has the same DNA. But so how does a cell know to become an eyeball or to become a hand? Ever thought about that? Because there's something telling it what to do. It's like the software. Next slide. So here's the software for the computer. It's all the apps and stuff you have on it. The software that tells you the chromosomes what to do is called the epigenome. And that's something that is kind of above your genes, but it tells them what to do. It tells each little cell, hey, you need to turn on this gene and turn off that gene. So it has control over all your DNA because it knows what to do. So that's what the epigenome does. Let's check my notes to see what comes next. Okay, next slide. So why do you care about epigenetics or the epigenome? Does anybody know anyone with diabetes in their family? Okay, lots of people. How about somebody with heart disease? No, those, you can keep your hands up for the diabetes and the heart disease and cancer. Anybody with cancer? Yeah. And all of these diseases are triggered by the epigenome. So, including Kabuki syndrome. So if we figure out more about how the epigenome works, we can potentially have an impact on all of those diseases that affect your family members or people you know. So that's science that can have a big impact on each one of you. So first we're going to explain how this might happen. So next. Genetic research. Genetic research, what is that? Somebody looks at somebody's genes. So first they have to, let's see, well, okay, so how does somebody go about looking at your genes? Yeah.
They take a blood sample.
They do. And in fact, Demi has had her genes looked at. How did it feel, Demi?
It tickled.
What did they really do? So we went to the doctor, and what did the doctor do?
He stick the needle into my arm.
And he took the blood sample, just like you said.
Then he sent it off to the lab.
He sent it off to the lab, and how many times have you done that?
3 times.
3 times, and where did you send it? You sent it to Philadelphia, and Boston, and Seattle.
And Seattle.
Yeah, so she's been involved with 3 different genetic research studies. Now, just a little timeline to give you an idea of how science kind of works. Back in 2001, which was actually the year Demi was born, the Human Genome Project was completed. That is when science mapped the entire genome, or the genetic code of all the DNA. They kind of knew everything was there. They certainly didn't know everything about it. That's what they're still learning about. So these first 2 studies, they were looking at Demi's genes, but they couldn't look really, really closely. They were kind of looking at, think of a satellite picture of the Earth from way out, and you can see, yeah, a chunk of that continent might be missing. That's the level that they were looking at. They couldn't zoom in real well. But then time passed, and by 2009, when they took another study, and they did a study from 2009 to 2010, they had learned a whole lot more about the human genome, and they were able at that time to zoom in, if you're looking from space, at a city and look at what houses might have moved in that city. So they were able to do a whole lot more. So in this study, next slide. Oh, there we go. There's my. This is what it was like before. If you think, oh, they could look at it, oh, this chunk of the continent might be gone, but now they can look at genes much more closely. And so the study that was done in Seattle was done by the University of Washington. And Demi was one of only 10 kids in the whole world where they took her blood and they studied it. These were 10 kids, each of which had Kabuki syndrome, and they were looking to see how are her genes different. And by this time, they knew how to zoom in and really look at things that they had not been able to see before. And a lot of genetic syndromes, they know what gene causes it and they can see it. With Kabuki, they had never known before until this study. So in this study, they were able to zoom in and they identified the actual gene that caused it. So Demi was part of that study. So she helped them to find out what gene caused that syndrome, which is a new scientific discovery. I thought it was pretty exciting. And that also, once they identified that gene, then other doctors could pick it up and study it more closely. And that is what Dr. Bjornson is now doing. Next. So Dr. Bjornson reason why he picked Kabuki syndrome to study, I'm not sure, but I'm glad he did. He wanted to figure out if, since the gene for Kabuki syndrome is part of the epigenome. It's part of the software. Remember we talked about how the epigenome is like software. So if there's a defect in the software and the underlying hardware, or the DNA, is good, then he's trying to figure out, can we correct that bug? It's okay. I don't care. He's trying to figure out if he can correct a bug in the software in order to make it work correctly. It's kind of like, you're doing one thing in a program and it doesn't do quite right, but then another part of the software is perfectly fine. So how would he do that? What he's doing is he constructed an experiment, and he said, okay, if I can create Kabuki syndrome in a rat, then maybe I can see if I can correct it. Now, how would he do that? What he is doing in his experiment is he's trying to damage a gene. It's kind of like he's trying to take a DVD and put a scratch on it. Has anybody ever had a scratch on a DVD? Yeah. And it just is not going to work, right? That scratch is there. And then sometimes you can get it and rub it off and put it back in there, and then it works. So he's trying to create a scratch to damage a gene. And then the rat will grow a little bit with this damaged gene, so his development will be changed. It'll be damaged. And then he's going to try to correct the scratch, or correct the defect in the software, so that the gene is working correctly again. And then development will continue correctly from that point. So that would be kind of like taking the film that they put on the DVD and correcting your little scratch, and then imagine if it works again. Of course, you missed out on all that time when it had the scratch and you couldn't watch the movie, but now you can watch the movie again. So that is what he is trying to do. So next slide. And so instead of filling in a scratch, he's changing the epigenome with drugs. And so he's trying to determine if changing that will fix that development, and what that means for everybody else. If his hypothesis is correct, and he is able to correct the gene with drugs, that means potentially that the issues that cause cancer, or heart disease, or diabetes, or a lot of other things that can be our environment contributes toward, that maybe those could be corrected the same way as Kabuki syndrome. Now, what this means directly for Demi is that if he finds a drug that will correct the gene, the single gene that has gone awry in her, then her development going forward might be normal. What does that mean? Well, that means that maybe the difficulty that she has learning might go away or diminish somewhat, so that she could take in information faster. That doesn't mean that she's necessarily going to be perfect or cured, but it would sure make life a lot easier. It would mean, be kind of like if two people have bicycles and they're pedaling along and one of them has a flat tire, that person's kind of at a disadvantage, right? But if you can pump the tire up again, they're still going to be behind in the race, but they're making forward progress again, aren't they? So that is the current event that we're talking about, and how science is directly influencing Demi today. I think that's it.
Yes, that was awesome.
Good job, Demi.